boss, the president of the University of New Hampshire, Mark Huddleston. Mark?
Well, thank you, Nancy. Nobody around here calls me boss. That's nice once in a while to hear that. Well, welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all here. I'm sorry we couldn't give you a nice, crisp, clear New Hampshire morning. We do get those occasionally, but nonetheless, it's wonderful to see everyone here. As Nancy said, I'm Mark Huddleston. It's my great privilege to serve as president of the University of New Hampshire, which is New Hampshire's flagship public research university. And we're all very proud of it here and happy to welcome you. But as we begin, let me address one question that may be on some of your minds at least. Why on earth is New Hampshire hosting a conference having to do with the oceans or blue water? After all, we're a state that is generally known maybe for mountains or beautiful lakes or maybe Adam Sandler or Mike O'Malley or things like that, but certainly not oceans. But in fact, we do have 13 miles or so of beautiful seacoast, although I actually Googled that this morning because I couldn't believe it was only 13 miles, and as always, there's controversy about whether it's 18 or 21 or 13, but depending on how you measure, we do have real seacoast. It's gorgeous seacoast, and we're very proud of it, wave for wave, mile for mile. It's as beautiful as any in the world, and we like to think that we're very attentive to the issues of the ocean. In fact, at UNH, we have made a major commitment to marine issues, marine policy. We are among only a handful of universities in America that is federally designated land, sea, and space grant as an institution. We are among the country's top 10 universities for marine science and ocean engineering. Our marine research activities attract roughly $25 million a year, even in these sequestered times. Our major marine facilities include the Judd Gregg Marine Research Lab over on the seacoast here, the Jerry Chase Ocean Engineering Lab right here in Durham on campus, the Jackson Estrin Lab on Great Bay, and the Shoals Marine Lab, also off the coast of New Hampshire. We operate a small fleet of ocean-going research vessels, and arguably even the UNH blue in our logo is honoring the importance of water resources. And of course, I should really emphasize this, it's absolutely true, we're extremely proud of the hosts of this forum. The UNH Center for Spills in the Environment and the School of Marine Science and Ocean Engineering. They really are true spires of excellence here at the University of New Hampshire. Really, though, our strongest marine resources are our faculty, our UNH faculty researchers and staff who provide tremendous talent, expertise, and skill as we study these issues. And among them is our forum convener, Professor Nancy Kinner, who I suspect is one of the reasons that you're all here. Nancy really is an amazing person. She is director of the Coastal Response Research Center and the Center for Spills in the Environment. She is among the foremost independent experts on hazards to coastal environments and the fate of spilled oil. She played an instrumental role in bringing together other leading researchers and experts from around the country in responding to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I'm especially proud of how she and other UNH faculty have teamed up today to bring all of you here. And I'm also honored to introduce right now one of our genuinely outstanding faculty researchers, Larry Mayer. Larry is the director of the UNH School of Marine Science and Ocean Engineering and the UNH Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping. He is also among the world's foremost researchers in marine geology and geophysics, and a veteran of research missions to the most remote regions of the world's oceans. In fact, we're lucky to have him here today. Usually he's on a research vessel someplace completely out of contact with the rest of us. So thank you all for joining us here today at this important forum and bringing your own insights, knowledge, and partnerships to UNH and to the global community. Larry, please come on up.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And as David said, and he even has a tie on, which is, for those of you who know me, is quite rare and very uncomfortable, I have to say. But actually, I call it my going to Washington clothes. But since Washington has come here, I'll wear them here. As Mark mentioned, I'm the director of the School of Marine Science and Ocean Engineering. And on behalf of that school, which is a brand new school here at UNH, I want to welcome you to this exciting and very important forum. As I said, the Marine School is brand new, and it's our first interdisciplinary school, and it's designed to bring together the great breadth and wide diversity of marine science and ocean engineering research that takes place here at UNH, and to bring it together under one interdisciplinary umbrella. And I can think of no better example, really, than the breadth and the quality of the marine work being done here, as well as our nimbleness and our very close relationship with our federal partners, than our involvement in several aspects of the response to the Deepwater Horizon spill. And starting, of course, with our host for the forum, Nancy Kinner, as Mark mentioned, is the director of several internationally renowned centers, the Center for Coastal Response Research and the Center for Spills in the Environment. And these centers were fostering research, sponsoring workshops, and generally raising awareness of our poor state of preparedness for an oil spill long before the Deepwater Horizon disaster. As a matter of fact, I think Nancy, I can't find her without the red hat ever. I'm sure she's off somewhere. I think she was actually hosting or holding a workshop on oil spill response in Alaska the day that the Deepwater Horizon re-exploded. Now, because of those ongoing activities and existing partnerships, UNH and NOAA were able to work very quickly together to implement IRMA. IRMA is the Environmental Response Management Application, a web-based tool that greatly enhanced the ability of responders and decision makers to manage the spill response. And this tool is now being implemented in a number of regions, including the Arctic. In our Hubbard Center for Genomic Studies, Kelly Thomas and his team used leading edge metagenomic research, and this is really barcode mapping, basically DNA barcode mapping, to understand the potential impact of the spill on benthic communities. And their involvement even extended to the social sciences, as Larry Hamilton from our Carsey Institute led a study of more than 2,000 residents of Louisiana and Florida to better understand their respective views on the disaster and the responses to it, with a very interesting result, and that's that Louisiana residents perceived the spill as a much more serious threat than their counterparts in Florida, but yet were much less prone to support mitigation efforts. And it's very, very interesting. It's something that responders have to take into account. I should mention that the involvement of social sciences in our marine research is a particularly exciting new direction, and one that will be greatly fostered by the establishment of the second interdisciplinary school at UNH, the Carsey School for Public Policy, and we're very excited about being able to interact with those folks there. Finally, I want to touch on the work that our Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping did in support of the Deepwater Horizon spill. Soon after the Deepwater Horizon explosion, when the seriousness of the spill in the Deepwater really became evident, the White House called a meeting and sought input from the academic community on approaches for addressing several questions, including the fate of the deep sea plume. Kate Moran, who is here today, and Marcia McNutt. Kate Moran, who was with OSDP at the time, Marcia, the director of the USGS at the time, were very involved in setting up that meeting. We at the center here had been working with new sonars that for the first time were capable of seeing in the water column as well as the seafloor. Mostly we're focusing on mapping the seafloor. And I suggested these sonars might be of some use in looking at the question of the deep plume. Given our close working relationship with NOAA, we were able to mount these sonars and place our people on several NOAA vessels in a very, very short time. We put systems on the Gordon Gunta and on the Thomas Jefferson. It didn't hurt that the captain of the Thomas Jefferson was one of our ex-students in the center, so it helped speed things up, but we got people and systems on the vessels. And within a few days, we were on the vessels developing software to try to look into the water column, and very, very quickly became able to see natural gas seeps, leaking pipelines, and leaking wellheads. We weren't allowed to get directly over the Macondo well at first, but once we were allowed directly over the well, we were able to directly see the oil plume acoustically. And on the top, an example of some gas heaps, the bottom, the actual oil plume as we got closer and closer to those stars circling around the Macondo well. We continued this kind of mapping until mid-July when BP was ready to once again try to cap the well. At that time, we were asked if our mapping systems could verify the integrity of the well capping process. And so we were able to bring the vessels over the wellhead, over the Macondo wellhead this time. And I had to 3 times a day often report to Secretary Chu and his science review panel, which again, both Kate and Marcia sat on. And on our first pass over the capped well, we were able to see that big yellow line there, an indication that there was gas leaking out of the newly capped well. BP was directed to find a leak. They sent remotely operated vehicles down and were relatively quickly able to determine that that's all it was, just those few little gas bubbles a minute leaking out. It was nothing serious, easy to manage. It was just a flange leak. They kept the ROVs on there for months, looking at it, making sure it didn't get worse. But again, it showed how sensitive the acoustic systems were if we were able to detect even the smallest of leaks. The brown stuff you see on top is actually gas hydrate, a frozen gas form, and every once in a while a piece of that would break off and rise to the surface, and we can even follow those pieces rising to the surface from several thousand meters. And so from mid-July to October, we maintained people on NOAA vessels and continually, several times a day, went back and forth with USGS scientists doing deeper seismic studies, looking at the stability of the capped well and guaranteeing its integrity. And so a small silver lining is kind of attached to this national disaster in that it led to the rapid development of some new tools and technology, and tools that we're continuing to develop and looking at new ways of using them. We're working hard now to see if we can turn those into quantitative tools, so not just look at where gas is seeping out, but how much gas is seeping out, looking at the flux of gas. Tom Weber, who I think is here, has been working very hard on this and actually producing some excellent papers showing how we can be quantitative if we make some assumptions. We've been working again very closely with NOAA trying to ground truth those studies, actually looking at bubbles rising, measuring, capturing bubbles with a remotely operated vehicle, looking at the bubble size distribution, capturing them and measuring flux rates, so that we can again calibrate our acoustic systems so that we can someday go out just with the acoustic systems alone and see if we can get an estimate of gas flux from both natural seeps and, should it happen again, from a spill. And now we've been bringing this to broad areas of the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic margin, and I just came back, as Mark mentioned, from 45 days in the eastern Siberian Arctic, where we're now trying just acoustically to estimate the flux of gas. And so some small good came out of this terrible disaster, but let's not kid ourselves, it certainly wasn't worth it. And this is why today's forum is so important, and why it behooves us to pay very close attention to what we have learned, and even more importantly, to admit what we still don't know. And if we can do that, hopefully we'll be much better prepared the next time, and I'm afraid that inevitably there will be a next time. We would certainly kid ourselves if we think that's not going to be the case. So on that cautionary note, let me introduce my friend and dear colleague, Nancy Kinner, who you've heard so much about, who's been long warning us about the need to be better prepared, and who has, as she always does, worked tirelessly to put this forum together. I got an email from you at 4:20 this morning. So Nancy.
Larry, this is why you couldn't find me. It's up here, man. Okay. Okay, Larry and I used to meet each other in the airport quite a lot when we were during the Deepwater Horizon, and I'd always end up saying, what were you there? Larry, I can't get this down up here. Here we go. What were you here for? And he'd always say he was here for something on the spill, and we'd have a nice chat flying home. So, well, it gives me a lot of pleasure to be here today. And we've been calling this the Oil Spill Response Forum for weeks, months now, since we started planning. My good friend and colleague David Kennedy and I started planning this forum. But the real title of it, and David cautioned me, this is really an academic title because, you know, here it goes on, is Oil Spill Response 25 years after the Exxon Valdez and in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon. What have we learned and what are we missing? Just to set the stage for you, in 2002, which is 12 years ago, we had oil spill response focus in this country that was really moribund. We weren't really thinking outside of the oil spill community about oil spill response and what needed to be done. The Exxon Valdez was 13 years in the past. There was very little R&D funding going in to oil spill response. We had solved the problem of oil spill response because we had double-hull tankers, right? There weren't going to be any more spills, as we were told many, many times. And we'd been lulled into complacency. But the oil spill response community, many of whom whose leaders are here today, knew that another spill not only could but would happen. And in fact, spills were happening, but they were flying below the radar. And so at that time, NOAA, particularly in the Office of Response and Restoration, made a decision to fund a center to focus on oil spill R&D, particularly related to response and restoration issues, to really revive that focus. And if you think back historically to who was the head of that office at that time, it was Dave Kennedy. So two centers were created. One was the Coastal Response Research Center, which receives only NOAA funding, and the other was the Center for Spills in the Environment, which is the parallel center, which receives other funding non-NOAA, and that is the center that is sponsoring today. Because one of the ideas that we had behind this forum is not to have funding from the government or funding from industry or funding from NGOs. This forum is funded solely by the University of New Hampshire. So the centers had 4 goals. The first was what one would think of for a center, to oversee and conduct basic and applied R&D with respect to spill response and restoration. But you'll notice that word outreach was in there, and that has been a component of a lot of what we do. And then to transform those results into practice, not just have them be research, but get them out there where scientific support coordinators, et cetera, could be using them. And then to serve as a hub for oil spill R&D for all stakeholders. And many of you may know that I always wear this circle pin because we bring together government, NGOs, the public, industry to all of our meetings. That is a crucial, crucial part of our meetings. Everybody comes to the table. And to facilitate collaboration among those stakeholders. And again, why UNH? Heck, we don't have any oil here, and we're not going to be getting any anytime soon. The answer to that is that NOAA knew that UNH had excellence in marine science, as Larry pointed out, ocean engineering, and environmental engineering. We also don't have oil production. And that's a real advantage, because no governor is ever going to call me up in the state of New Hampshire and do anything except ask for my vote. They are not going to call me up in the middle of a spill and say, don't say that. So that's a good place to be. In fact, sometimes my provost, who was just here and left, so I'll just say this after she's gone, my provost sometimes says, go get him, Kinner. And we have a reputation as being an honest and independent broker to be able to say what needs to be said and to bring people together. So, what did the center do before Deepwater Horizon? Well, we ran 2 5-year oil spill response R&D plans where we brought everybody together to think about what issues we needed to fund and to try and coordinate research on those issues. We ran numerous workshops on dispersants and dispersed oil when nobody was paying attention. Seems funny in the wake of Deepwater Horizon. We ran workshops on human dimensions, submerged oil, environmental response management, oil spill toxicity, spill modeling, and Arctic spill response, all before Deepwater. After Deepwater, we've run R&D meetings subsequently and have worked on the Interagency Coordinating Committee on Oil Pollution Research, ICOPAR's federal R&D plan. We've continued our work on dispersants and dispersed oil, human dimensions, submerged oil, added on environmental disaster data management, oil sands spill response, Arctic natural resource damage assessment, and use of dispersants in Arctic spill response. So how today's forum came about. We knew that there were historic milestones coming about, the 25-year anniversary of the Exxon Valdez and the 5-year anniversary of the Deepwater, which is 6 months from now. And we said to ourselves, David and I, what can we learn from these spills? What issues were paramount during these spills and still remain today? And we decided that the University of New Hampshire was the institution to do this forum. We could bring people together to discuss this. So, the focus of the forum is what have we learned from the Exxon Valdez and Deepwater spills, and how do they inform future spill response? And what should we do differently to address the spills of the future? Now, this is not a forum on spill response devices and things like that. We're going to focus on what we think are 4 major topics that need to be addressed and are perennial problems in spill response. The first is the role of academic science in spill response. The second is communication, particularly via the media. The third is human dimensions, both social and public health. And the fourth is policy and politics. And if you look at those 4 topics, we want to try and think through what the solutions to those issues might be. And we submit to you that the solutions to those issues are not legislative, thank goodness, because we don't get anything done legislatively anymore. They're not regulatory. They are really transforming those recommendations into practice. And if we have the will to do it, we can. So, the outcome of this forum will be the usual videotapes that people can download and will be a report. But more importantly, we are asking this cross-section of experts that we've gathered here today to help us generate some consensus recommendations on how we can move forward to address those 4 key issues that are highlighted during this forum. So, having told you what the forum's about, let me tell you about the 2 types of sessions that we have. First, we're going to be examining specific spills, Exxon Valdez and Deepwater, and then tomorrow we're going to be looking at future spills, particularly those that might occur in the Arctic and those that are occurring inland via rail and pipeline. And for these 3 sessions, we're going to have 2 keynote speakers, one kind of reflecting a response theme and the other the science theme. And then we'll have a panel come up of key participants during those spills who are government, industry, and NGO reps. The second type of a session that's going to occur, and there are 4 of these, are panels of key participants and who can give us key perspectives on the issues of the role of academic science in spill response, communication via the media, human dimensions, particularly social and public health, and then policy and politics. So today, we're going to look at 2 different spills, the Exxon Valdez and the Deepwater Horizon. But first, we thought it was important to kind of put these into a context. So Gary Shigenaka is going to come up and talk about an overview of oil spills in the US. And we picked Gary because he is right on. He's just done a kind of an overview of this, and he's also a very entertaining speaker. No pressure there, Gary. Then we're having 2 panels today, a panel on the role of science in spill response and a panel on the role of the media in spill response. And in between those 2, there's going to be a time for networking. Tomorrow, we'll look first at future spill scenarios, and then those 3 panels, human dimensions on social and public health, policy and politics, and then we're going to ask some of our key folks to come up and think about the path forward. Now, for you, your job is asking questions, and we're going to encourage questions, and there are 2 ways to do questions, all right? We talked with our participants and our speakers and came up with this. So the first way is you can, during any part of this conference, get on unh.edu and OSR or Oil Forum, either one, type that in. And if you're on that website, you'll see Submit a Question. And you can hit that button that says Submit a Question and just put your question in and it'll appear up here. The other way you can do it, if you so desire, is to write it on a card, and we have folks who will give you those cards and pick them up, and we'll get those up here as well. So those are the two ways. We also haven't wasted a lot of paper on bios and agendas, because we know you can go online with your smartphones, et cetera, and see that. So today we're going to start with the overview of spills in the U.S., and Gary Shigenaka, who is from NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration. Gary? Thank you for setting you up. Okay. Whoops. I know this is supposed to be up here. There it is, Shiggy. Okay, woo. There you go, Gary. You're welcome.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm a little bit intimidated to be opening such an auspicious gathering. Let me just dive right into it. I think I first need to make the case that I have the standing to introduce you to sort of an overview of oil spills in the U.S. For those of you who don't know me, it's probably more important for those who do know me that I make the case that I have the standing to be doing this. But my career has really been bookended by the two spills that are defining this conference, the Exxon Valdez and the Deepwater Horizon, and I've worked a number of spills in between. I've been thinking about this idea of the history of oil spills, not only in the U.S. but around the world, and then the context. What does it mean for us as responders? So I started thinking about this before the Deepwater Horizon, so I've had a lot of time to think about it. It's a work in progress, so please understand that. But hopefully today I can just give you a little bit of information, maybe tell you something about some of the spills you haven't heard of. From my perspective, it's important to think about what's happened in the past because it gives us context. We might learn something from what's happened in the past, but we as responders might learn something. I think it's important to put it also into a, excuse me, a broader social context of how we think about oil spills. So I did want to mention that there are certain things I'm not going to talk about. There are major spills that have happened in the U.S., such as the Santa Barbara spill in 1969. I'm not going to talk about that because you can go online, you can find out about that particular spill. We also have in our audience today an expert on some of those old spills, Al Allen. If you want to raise your hand, stand up. Al actually worked as a responder during the 1969 Santa Barbara spill response, so he is truly one of our old hands and is a good source of information. This is from the Santa Barbara spill. I just wanted to show this picture because it's a cool picture, and you don't see it too often for oil spills. But anyways, what I found in looking at the history of oil spills in the U.S., you really have to think about the history of oil. And so in the U.S., the common benchmark is Titusville, Pennsylvania, and Colonel Edwin Drake and what happened in Pennsylvania back in the 1850s, 1859. But of course, there's been oil in the country, around the world, for tens of thousands of years. These are game pieces that were found in California. They were used by the Yakuts Indians as sort of like dye. They're made out of black walnut and oil, and there are pieces of abalone embedded in there. So they're sort of like dice, but people have encountered oil for a long, long time in human history. We've also been sacrificing the environment in the name of oil for a long time. This is another shot of the oil country in Pennsylvania in the 1850s. You can see that very quickly, whatever natural resources were present in this area were sacrificed in the name of developing oil. I do need to mention, since I work for NOAA, and we, of course, are the trustees for large marine mammals, that ironically, the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania and other parts of the world probably saved the populations of the great whales in the oceans. This is a cartoon from Vanity Fair in 1861. You see a convention of sperm whales who are celebrating the discovery of oil. And it says, if you can't read the caption, grand ball given by the whales in honor of the discovery of oil, of the oil wells in Pennsylvania. And in the background, you can see the banners that say, "We whale no more for our blubber, oil's well that ends well." Of course, whale oil was used as a lighting and a lubricant, and the discovery of petroleum actually did save these wonderful animals. So we get into the history of oil spills, and it's really been hard to nail down because there isn't a lot in the history before the 20th century about oil spills per se. But if you look at some of the images of oil production, you see images like this. And this, again, is from Harper's in 1882. It's an oil production well in Pennsylvania. And it's oil storage tanks that are simply overflowing onto the ground. A very common practice. And you don't need to read all of this, but it basically just details, this is from an account in the 1860s, that details that there was no storage for the oil that was being discovered in great quantities in Pennsylvania, and so it was just allowed to flow onto the ground, into the streams and rivers, and as you see in the last sentence here, sometimes it flowed in the rivers 140 miles downstream. Now, we've had problems with transporting oil from the very beginning. This is another image from the oil country in the 1860s in Pennsylvania. It's called a pond freshet, and here's a photograph of the same sort of thing. The oil that was being produced in Pennsylvania was put into barrels, and then there wasn't really sufficient water to transport it to the ports and refineries in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. So the very clever folks who were producing the oil came up with a system of damming up Oil Creek, and then when people were ready to transport the oil downstream, they would cut open the dams, and there would be something like a demolition derby of boats that went downstream and inevitably crashed and spilled a lot of oil. Here's one account from the Times of London that again, you don't have to read this whole thing, but I found this very interesting here. In this one incident, 50,000 barrels of oil were said to be lost, and that's a lot of oil in any century. That's about 2 million gallons of oil that were spilled just in trying to transport it downstream. This also provided the opportunity for entrepreneurs. These are children, little girls, who waited on the side of the banks of the rivers when these events happen and oil spilled into the streams and rivers. They would dip it out. They're called oil dippers, and they would then put it into their own barrels and sell it or use it for their own use. So this is from a contemporary book in 2000, but this tells you why we don't hear too much about the negative effects of spilling oil in the environment. People really didn't think of spilling oil as a big deal. It was just a consequence of production of oil. So again, these are the reasons that I think it's important to look back into the context of what has happened. There's also this human dimension. Of course, a lot of the incidents that have occurred over the years have an element of tragedy and bravery, and this is one of my favorite pieces, and irony as well. And let me just give you two examples from the two spills that are defining the conference today. This is the first item of irony, which for many years I thought was either mythical or apocryphal. This is a shipping calendar from 1989 from Exxon Shipping. You know, the spill occurred on March 24th, 1989, and of course the pinup picture for March 1989 was the Exxon Valdez. You can see at the top of the calendar it says, "Take time to be careful now." So, first example. Second example is a little more complicated for the Macondo spill, the Deepwater Horizon. I was wondering what was the origin of the name of that particular prospect and that well, Macondo. Well, it turns out that its origin comes from this book, 100 Years of Solitude. Some of you may have read it. It's by a Nobel Prize-winning Colombian author, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And in this book, the city that he is describing throughout the novel is called Macondo. Well, it turns out that when this prospect was discovered, and I think this is real, I've read it in two accounts, BP offered naming rights to the new prospect to its employees as a way to raise money for United Way. So whoever pledged the most money got to name the well. The people who won within BP named it Macondo, which to me is ironic because this is an image of Macondo, the city. Ironic because Macondo in the book was cursed with magic, and mostly really bad magic. And there are these ongoing themes in the book about circularity of time, the repetition of mistakes, and self-fulfilling prophecies. So it seems a curious name for a major oil prospect. But if we use that as a jumping off point to think about some of these spills in the past, the circularity of time, okay, well, here's a shot of Deepwater Horizon. Many of you have seen many images like this. 31 years prior, there was this kind of an image from another spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Many of you have heard of the Ixtoc-1, which here's a comparison that I put together. The first two items, the wellhead depth and the duration in days, don't really match up very well. The Ixtoc-1 was much shallower than the Macondo well. And Ixtoc actually went on for much, much longer, closing in on a year versus the 3 months that the Deepwater Horizon spilled oil. But if you look at the other criteria here, they match up pretty well. The oil volume, estimated oil volume that was spilled is similar. The cause, there was a loss of drilling mud circulation, which is an essential part of establishing a well. In both cases, that played a major role in causing the initial accident. There was a fire and explosion. The blowout preventer in both cases did not function properly. There were a lot of dispersants used in 1979. In fact, probably more than were used during the Deepwater Horizon. Those of you who paid attention during Deepwater Horizon heard of something called the junk shot, where the flow from the well was, they tried to stem the flow by putting in things like tires and rope and golf balls, which the media had a field day with, of course. But they tried that during the Ixtoc as well. A containment structure was attempted during Ixtoc-1 as well. Instead of Top Hat from Deepwater Horizon, we had Operation Sombrero, which reflects the fact that it happened in the Bay of Campeche in Mexico. And ultimately, both of these spills were finally killed by the drilling of relief wells. So, you know, if you go back and further into the past and try to determine the first oil spills, this often comes up as the benchmark. You Google first oil spill, and oftentimes the Torrey Canyon comes up. And this was a very famous, the first of the supertanker spills in England in 1967. It happened at the very tip of England. Here you see a close-up from Google Earth, and that is Seven Stones Rock, and that's where the Torrey Canyon went aground and spilled its load. Quite a story unto itself. To the left of Seven Stones Rock, you see the Isles of Scilly, which we'll return to for another historical spill in just a bit. But the Torrey Canyon really was what gave dispersants and chemical shoreline cleaners a bad name. They were used rather indiscriminately. They were a very different kind of chemical than what we have in our stockpiles today, but it really set the tone for some bad karma. The other benchmark for first oil spills are the oil spills that occurred during World War II. These come up quite a bit, and for good reason, because in 1942, Germany began a campaign of using their U-boats to sink American and Canadian shipping along the east coast of North America. And as you can see with these numbers, a lot of ships went down and a tremendous amount of oil spilled, 145 million gallons, and that translates into about 800,000 gallons a day, and much of that was off the coast of North Carolina. There are surprisingly few photographs of shoreline impacts, but I did find a few. These were from Life magazine, a photographer by the name of Marie Hansen, who recorded these shots from the Jersey shore, and they look very familiar to those of us who have responded to oil spills over the years. They look like a typical oil spill on a sand beach. You can see also in the lower photographs mechanical and manual cleanup. In that case, they just scraped the oil from the surface of the sand beaches and put the oil into sand pits and buried it. I feel compelled to also mention that it wasn't just the East Coast and U-boat attacks that resulted in large amounts of oil being spilled during World War II. This is a shot from Dutch Harbor, Alaska, which was attacked in 1942 by the Japanese around the same time as Midway Island during the Midway campaign. And what you see in the background is a fire resulting from the Japanese attacks. There were 4 very large oil storage tanks in Dutch Harbor that spilled oil. And in addition to this, there were a couple of incidents where the Americans decided to empty the oil tanks in Dutch Harbor just to prevent oil fires like this. So about 1 million gallons was spilled intentionally by U.S. forces into Dutch Harbor. And the interesting thing is that the cleanup, the remedial cleanup of the soil in Dutch Harbor was just completed in the last 10 years by the state of Alaska and the Corps of Engineers. So here's a map of oil spills around the world, large oil spills. You know, there's this one, which I'm not going to go into because it's not U.S., but this is widely acknowledged as being the largest oil spill ever in the Arabian Gulf during the first Gulf War in 1991. And again, the numbers, it's hard to estimate exactly how much spilled, but a heck of a lot. And I think it's clear that it's probably the largest spill in history. There were multiple sources. Many of you probably had some experience with this particular incident. Then we have the 2 other boxes that I just highlighted. Of course, Deepwater Horizon, Exxon Valdez. You can see how small Exxon Valdez actually is in the context of large oil spills around the world. But then there's this. And this leads me to ask the question of the audience, what is the largest spill in U.S. history? And I'll give you a hint here. Oh, you guys have peaked. You looked at the textbook or something. It's true. This is not very many people. The brown-nosing good students have actually studied ahead, but this is the largest spill in U.S. history. It was a well blowout in 1910, 1911 in Maricopa, California, and it spilled a heck of a lot of oil. You can see almost 400 million gallons, and at its peak flow was spilling almost 4 million gallons a day. And I'm just going to show you some of the photos from that particular spill. Pretty impressive. And this is not water that's flowing. And in fact, in this next picture, it's labeled as a river of oil. So this was completely uncontained. It was just flowing all over. And as we tried to do 100 years later, a containment structure over the well, which was just as successful back in 1910 as it was in 2010. Eventually, the leaking well was surrounded with sandbags and the oil was contained. They tried to recover as much of the oil as possible because that was a commodity. And finally, the flow began to subside, and ultimately it just, I just wanted to show this. That's great duty there on the side there to the left, isn't it? But ultimately, the flow from this well stopped on its own and collapsed. I just pulled this Google Earth photograph last night. It shows a crater in the middle of the California desert, but not much else. And if you go down lower, the scale on this thing is about maybe 7 feet across, I guess. You can see layers of asphalted material, but not a whole lot else. But, you know, it is the desert, right? So this is our first benchmark, the largest spill in U.S. history, the Lakeview Well from 1910 and 11. You know, while we were working the Deepwater Horizon, there was this spill in the Midwest, which very few people really heard about. It was a pipeline break in Michigan. Inside Climate News, which won a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on this spill, called it the biggest oil spill you never heard of. And many people did not hear about it because it was happening in the background of Deepwater Horizon. But here are the stats on this spill. It was a lot of oil. It was nearly 1 million gallons, maybe even more. And it was a spill, our first major spill of what we call diluted bitumen, which is one of those products that we'll talk about tomorrow, one of the newer products coming out of Canada. And interestingly, the cleanup is just winding down. The formal cleanup for Deepwater Horizon ended this year, but the cleanup for the Enbridge pipeline spill is continuing on now. It is just winding down. And it was had a number of major environmental impacts, so this was not a small deal. But you know, the question is, was it really the largest freshwater spill? And so I asked one of my colleagues and the expert on all things oil spill context, Dagmar Schmidt-Etkin, whether it was the largest freshwater spill in the country. And she really had to take a close look at the question, and I really had to define my criteria. So I told her, yeah, I'm just interested in rivers, lakes, and streams, and any kind of oil. And she told me, no, it wasn't. And just quickly, she came up with a number of other spills that were much, much larger. But again, things that many of us had never really even heard of. And so I guess the take-home lesson from this is a lot happens in inland areas. There's a lot of oil that's spilled there, and maybe we should be paying a little bit more attention to what goes on in those inland areas, because that's where a lot of our population is. That's where the pipelines and freshwater aquifers are. So the Enbridge spill, it was a big freshwater spill, but not the biggest, and it was our first dilbit spill. Now we begin to get back into the historical part of the journey, and Thomas W. Lawson, this is a really interesting, actually a fabulous-looking sailing ship. It was the only 7-masted schooner ever built, and it was the largest sail-only ship that was built. It also played a role in our first tanker spill. And here are the particulars. It wound up that this ship was too big to be really practical, but they did use it, converted it into an oil tanker, and in 1907 decided to haul a load of light oil over to England from Philadelphia. And en route on its one-way transatlantic journey, the Thomas W. Lawson ran into not one, not two, but 3 different storms. And the third storm did it in, and again, it happened in the Isles of Scilly, which, if you remember, is very close to where the Torrey Canyon went aground. So on that third gale, the ship tried to anchor up. It broke both of its anchors. It lost all of its masts. 16 of its 18 crew members were lost, and it spilled 2 million gallons of that light oil. So I think it's relatively safe to say that it may be our first U.S. tanker spill. Again, this is where it happened. You can see why the Isles of Scilly are treacherous for vessels. This is from the International Space Station, and that's where the Thomas W. Lawson ran aground. So first U.S. tanker spill. Here's an interesting one for those of you who have an interest in the law. This is the SS Santa Rita. And no, it's not the SS Santa Rita there in the foreground. It's photobombing in the background. This is the only photograph I could find of the Santa Rita. And also involved in this particular incident was the French bark. Let me see if I can get this pronunciation. Valdez. Okay, I've been pronouncing that, or practicing that. So here are the particulars. This happened in Oakland. The Santa Rita, for whatever reason, was losing oil into Oakland Harbor, and it was sparked off by some sort of machinery on the dock. The resulting fire wound up damaging the bark Valdez, and the owners of the French bark took the Santa Rita to court to try to recover their damages. Now, this was not a pollution incident, but it was a lawsuit that was filed, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's why there's such great documentation. If you go to the court records, you get all the information you want about this incident. So I think of it as the first official oil spill because it's documented in official U.S. legal records. Now, after this, in the 1920s, there was a different kind of ethic that was beginning to take place in, at least in the United States, some sort of environmental awareness. And after several years of shipping using oil as a fuel, people began to realize there's a lot of oil pollution going on. And so people began to think that, well, maybe it's not such a great thing that we're dumping all this oil into our waters. And this resulted in the passage of something called the Oil Pollution Act. And many of you may say, well, no, that was 1990. That was Exxon Valdez when we got the Oil Pollution Act. But in fact, we got the Oil Pollution Act in its first iteration in 1924. And this particular ship played a role in testing out the Oil Pollution Act. And the particulars here came from a California Fish and Game Bulletin from 1925, but it turns out that the Columbia was caught pumping oil into San Francisco Bay. They were taken to court, to district court, I think, in California, and they were found not guilty, or not guilty under the Oil Pollution Act of intentionally fouling the waters, but this was taken up by the U.S. district attorney in California, and they actually got a conviction on it. So I think this may be the first oil pollution conviction under the Oil Pollution Act. I'm sort of bumping up against my time limit, but let me go through this. This is, for those of you biologists who are in the audience, this is a good one. Tampico, probably never heard of this one. Another one that happened in Mexico, very stunning photographs. It was a ship that was destined to be scrapped, and so they thought, well, hey, we can double up on this particular mission over to Japan. We can load it up with oil and sell the oil, and then they can scrap the ship once it gets to Japan. But it never made it to Japan. It only made it to the coast of Baja, where it grounded and leaked out its whole cargo of diesel oil. Fortunately for us, this was monitored for a long period of time by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Wheeler North from Caltech, who looked at this thing for 27 years. And as far as I know, it was the first oil spill effects monitoring that ever took place. And he said that initially the results were disastrous, and you can see why. It caused widespread death and destruction in the intertidal zone. These are lobsters, abalone, and there's a fish in the lower center there it just wiped everything out in this cove where the oil spilled. Wheeler found, again, these kinds of findings are consistent with some of the monitoring that we did in NOAA after the Exxon Valdez, and it's consistent with some of the other studies that have taken place since 1957. What I wanted to put up here was just the fact that Wheeler made some very interesting observations about natural variability, the role of natural variability in determining oil spill effects. And he said, you know, even if the oil spill hadn't occurred, there would be changes that would be going on in this habitat that we're monitoring. So we need to keep that in mind when we look at future impacts to oil spills. So quickly, the first Arctic spill, SS Jonathan Harrington, 1944. There were Navy maneuvers near Barrow. This ship ran aground. Instead of trying to lighter the ship to transfer the oil to another vessel, they just pumped it overboard. And so one of the residents, one of the elders up there, Thomas Brower, made these observations in an oral history in 1978, and he said that they just pumped it overboard, and he saw how thick the oil was and the impacts that it had on the local biota. So first Arctic spill. So this is really what we've gone through very quickly. I'm not going to talk about cleanup, but I did find this very interesting graphic from the 16th century that shows people sopping up oil from the surface of the ocean. Looks very familiar and looks very much like this sort of thing, right? But they were picking it up for to use the oil, not to get it out of the environment. Which brings me to I want to close on Exxon Valdez because remember Wheeler North observed this timeline of recovery, and that's really what we've observed with Exxon Valdez as well. We monitored, my colleague, Alan Mearns in Seattle, has done this thing called Mearns Rock, where he's looked at a single boulder in Prince William Sound for 20-some-odd years, and even after the impacts of the oil spill have long faded, he's observed great variability over time. We did the same thing on an experimental basis in Kasutsina Bay, Alaska, under the tutelage of Dr. Terry Klinger at University of Washington, and we saw the same sort of thing, a lot of variability from year to year. And if you plot out, this is for mussels, if you plot this out, you see it changes a lot and it has nothing to do with an oil spill. But what it may have something to do with is larger changes that are going on in the oceans, larger scale things. This happens to be the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. If you clip out the section where we have looked in Kasutsina Bay and compare the two, let's see if I can get this. There, we overlay the PDO in red and the mussels in green. You can see there seems to be some sort of a correlation between these large-scale influences and what's going on in the intertidal. And the same thing, this is another correlation with some of the seaweed. It's a negative correlation. When things are cold, then there seems to be more seaweed. When it's warm, there's less seaweed. So again, we return to what Wheeler North told us about there are things in the background that are going on that we really need to pay attention to if we're assessing oil spill impacts. And I think the lesson for us as we look to the future, which is kind of the theme of the meeting here this week, is that there are changes going on in our environment, whether it's the Arctic or other parts of our marine habitats, and we need to pay attention to what's going on there if we're ever going to understand what the long-term impacts or the short-term impacts of oil spills are going to be. So I think that's about all I have, but it's a very quick trip, and I hope there was something interesting for you, and I hope it kind of sets the tone, sets the stage for what goes on for the rest of the week. Thank you.